The real power of Glide doesn't lie in knowing all of the individual features of it. It lies in being creative in how you combine these together to design functionality that didn't exist before and that solves a real problem. In the data editor, we chain columns together to create new types of computation. In the layout editor, we place and group components to create new types of interfaces. And in the workflow editor, we can create totally new sequences or conditional branching actions that can run many, many different steps with just a single trigger. Now, you can still build very useful apps without ever opening the workflow editor. Single actions on components can be incredibly powerful, letting users set column values, make API calls, prompt Glide AI, and even trigger integrations. But knowing how to create app interaction workflows really levels up the complexity of problems you can solve. In this video, we're going to review some of the core principles of app interaction workflows, cover a high-level perspective of what you can do with them to get you thinking, and then look at some examples of app interaction workflows that we built into Glide University. You can create new app interaction workflows in the workflow editor or from the layout editor. When you create a workflow from the layout editor, the data source for that workflow will be based on the data source for that screen. For example, on this screen here, our data source is the items table. So when we create a workflow on this button, its data source will default to the items table and we won't be able to change it. But when you create a new app interaction workflow in the workflow editor, you first have to choose what data source that workflow will be operating on. In other words, app interaction workflows have to be associated with an underlying table, just like screens. When you select the app interaction trigger at the top of your workflow, you can see the data source that it's operating on and navigate to where it's being used in your layout. Clicking off this button, you can also see the run history of this workflow, allowing you to get a sense of how often this workflow is being triggered and diagnose any potential issues. App interaction workflows are triggered when users interact with components, collections, or form submissions. When you add a single action on a component in the layout editor, that action doesn't get saved to the workflow editor. So if you delete that component, the action is therefore lost. But when you create a new workflow here, it gets saved to the workflow editor and then can be reused as many times as you want. As you can see here, we now have an app interaction workflow that just contains a single action. But for now, this means it's centralized in the workflow editor so that we can reuse or update it in the future. Another simple use for app interaction workflows is just adding a single extra step to simple actions in order to log that the action has been triggered. For example, here in this workflow, we're triggering a Mixpanel event so that we can log in our analytics that a user has triggered this workflow. Now, while workflows itself automatically creates two log tables, you might also want to do this with your own custom secondary table so that whenever a user does a specific thing, a new row gets logged to that table so that you can know about it clearly and do things with that data. Often when a user presses a button, you don't just want one or two things to happen, you want many things to happen. For example, log a row, set column values, trigger a webhook, play a sound, show notification, move the user back a screen, and then notify your team in Slack, or even log in analytics. To the user, a workflow like this might just feel like one fluid interaction, like a confirmation on a button. But for you and the functionality of this app, it's doing a lot more work behind the scenes. The other dimension within app interaction workflows is that of branches based on conditions. Just like you can set conditions on components and their visibility, you can also set conditions on the different branches of workflows, which will then determine which sequence is run. For example, if a user with type A pushes the button, then it does one thing, and if a user with type B pushes the button, it does another thing. Many of our experts actually end up only creating workflows, even if they just have single actions, because it's just a very organized and safe way of working. If an app has been built with only workflows and you've named them well, anyone can get a really good overview of how the app works just by reviewing its workflows and then visiting where these are used in the layout editor. So let's look at some examples, and for this we're going to go a bit meta and look at Glide's LMS, Glide University, which was built entirely on Glide. Now, there's a good chance that you're actually experiencing this right now as you're navigating and learning and completing lessons. These workflows you see here are being triggered. Now, you can see that the LMS is a fairly complex app, and we have a bunch of workflows that support things like bookmarking, certification, custom navigation, lesson completion, and more. So let's look at some of these. So starting with the simple ones, we have some here that just have one action, but are simply saved to the workflow editor for us to be able to reuse them. And then we also have others that just add a tracking component that we spoke about earlier. Now, a feature of the LMS that we get asked about a lot is the previous and next buttons on the certification quiz. The question that we show in this custom collection is powered by a query column that just shows one question at a time. And the question that it shows is filtered by a number in the data editor we call index. The next action then increments the index number so that updates the query and what therefore is shown in the quiz. We then wrap this in a condition that checks to see whether the index is less than the total number of questions. If it is, it increments the number, and if it's not, it just makes a sound to signify the quiz is over. The submit pass workflow is used when someone has the minimum number of correct answers on a test and then submits their test for approval. This workflow then navigates them back and shows the right screen, sets the time they submitted, adds a row to the passes table, and then sends the details of this certification to our other tools at Glide so that the rest of the Glide team can see who's passed certification. As we saw, when a user has passed certification in the LMS, a new row is added to the passes table with a reference number. We then use that reference number in a condition that allows them to run this workflow. The workflow then takes the certification data and passes it to Docs Automator. Docs Automator then generates a PDF and outputs the URL of that PDF to this column. And then we show that user in the app and allow them to download their certification. We also send a message to Slack to let the education team know that a new certification has been completed and by which user. So that was a deep dive into app interaction workflows. We covered some of the core concepts, had a look at why different people use workflows and how some of our experts exclusively use them even for simple actions. And we also had an overview of some of the app interaction workflows that power Glide University. If you want to learn more about the individual actions that you can put inside of your workflows, you can check out our docs. And to see how members of the community and Glide experts are using workflows in really exciting ways, you can join the discussion at glideapps.com/community.